So, hello. Something come up in my news this morning, and it said that Donald Trump had won his appeal against his conviction for, I think it was 2023, for his fraud case. So that came up in my news feed. Now, I looked into it because I was like, I didn't even know he was appealing it. I didn't know that the appeal was allowed. I was like, what does this mean? Apologies for my cough there. But anyway, so according to Megyn Kelly and according to Donald Trump himself, well, they said slightly different things. So Donald Trump himself said he's been exonerated of all wrongdoing, completely dismissed. Now, Megyn Kelly, I looked at hers, and of course, Megyn Kelly is right wing, generally doesn't completely align with Donald Trump, but generally on his side. She said something slightly different. She said, yes, he's basically been exonerated, but there was a split decision by the judges. And I go, okay, so split decision. So there were 5 judges. So I was like, okay, so was this a majority decision? And it was a bit more complicated because you apparently had one judge said one thing, 2 said something else, and another 2 said something else. So you had 3 opinions amongst 5 judges. Normally you have, 3 go one way or 2 go one way, or it's either unanimous or it's majority. You don't normally have a minority decision. And they kind of went, well, okay, so one of them said he's completely exonerated, and the other 4, well, 2 of them said he was, they were finding him guilty, but not giving him any penalty or, well, they said a much lower penalty. They haven't said how much, but they're throwing out the degree of penalty that he was given, which was, I think it was 370 million, but with interest it's now 550 million, which I just have to say, that's 50% interest in 2 years. How do you get that? The interest rates are not that high. They're nowhere near that high. Current interest rates are like 3-4%. So how do you get 50 in 2 years? I mean, I wish my bank balance was increasing that quickly. That's ridiculous. So not only was it ridiculously high, but the interest is ridiculously high. And I don't know how they're calculating that kind of interest. And I mean, I think that needs to come into question. Because 50% in 2 years, and I know that's not 50% per year, but that's got to be like 24% per year. And we're not at that situation in any scenario. Now, even if I owed money on my credit card, which is about the highest interest you can possibly get, it's not going to be 50% in 2 years. So I don't know how they got that, but that's really not really relevant because they're throwing out that judgment. They've thrown it out. They've thrown out the amount. But we also need to note that 2 of them asked for a retrial. So if they'd had a retrial, they would start it again. So they'd throw out not only the conviction but the amount, also the amount, and they would go ahead with. So they go ahead with a completely new thing. And of course, if the 3 other judges of the appeal, the ones that, because that's essentially a neutral decision. Throwing it out, ordering a new retrial is essentially neutral. That's not either saying yes or no. So if you have 1 out of 3, because we're not counting the 2 that are ordering a retrial, 1 out of 3 is saying dismiss the case, there's nothing against him. And 2 out of 3 are saying dismiss find him guilty, but dismiss the amount and have a much lower amount. Now, we don't know what much lower means. Then we have to say there's no chance, because none of the 5 are suggesting that he should have to pay 350 million or anything like that. Because the most they're saying is a conviction, guilty, but much lower. So that's the most they're saying. So 40% are saying a conviction, but much lower. And we don't know what much lower means. Now, obviously, there's always a bit of an interpretation. And the words much lower, you sort of think, what does that mean? So if the original conviction was $350 million, and this is US dollars, obviously, before interest, we're not counting the interest, what does much lower mean? So if I said to somebody, all right, you're getting an award of $365, let's just say dollars instead of millions. What would it be if someone said, no, that's far too high. We need to give you a much lower amount. What would the much lower mean? A number of interpretations. Let's say if I then said, oh, I'll give you $100. Would $100 be much lower than 365? I'd say no, that's actually within scope. I mean, if I got $365 and then it was reduced to 100, I'd be saying, well, that's lower. It's not much lower. So what does much lower mean? Well, it probably means 50. So compared to 365, I'd probably be looking at 50, because if I said 50 and you said, oh, that was much lower, I'd say, yeah, that was much lower. So 50 or less. Because if I said 10, you're only getting $10 instead of 365. I'd also be saying much lower. In fact, the much lower, in interpreting that in real terms, from that plain English term, would be anywhere from 0 to 50. It could be 0. 0 is also much lower. So we would therefore be looking at a judgment between 0 and 50 million. Now, that's only the decision of 2 of the 5. So 40% have decided it should be much lower. That's between 0 and 50. One has decided it's nothing, and the other 2 haven't made a decision. So therefore, if we use that interpretation and we use it when getting a numerical term for what people have used plain English for. So one is saying no conviction and nothing. The other 2 are neutral. We're not worrying about them. They're not part of the picture. We've got 2 saying much lower, but with a conviction. So we've got 3 not saying, well, 2 not saying anything. They're just saying a retrial, and 1 saying no conviction. So 1 is no conviction, 2 is a conviction. 1 is no money, and 2 is anywhere from 0 to 50 million, effectively. We don't know where it stands. So if we divide the 2, or the 3, then we'd say, okay, 0 to 50 averages 25, 0 averages 0. So we do 25 plus 25 plus 0, and we get 50 divided by 3 gives us 18. Sorry, 17, 16.7. So his actual fine could end up being $16.7 million. However, is that what it will actually be? Well, we haven't actually got a term yet. They haven't decided on the amount. Now, I'm going to now talk about how NBC News, who's on the left side of the media, how they've reported it. And they've said, sorry, they've done a fact check on it, which is ridiculous. They've done a fact check on it and said, no, it wasn't overturned at all. It's just a minor technicality, they've said. Now, Wikipedia, who claim to be neutral, Wikipedia have neutral point of view, NPOV. It's one of their core, probably the main core part of it. They've said their neutral bit is about 10 words on it, not 10 lines, 10 words, that says he had a minor technicality where he might lose a small amount. We don't know how much. A minor technicality. Now you can look at the actual judgment. It does not say minor technology. It says much lower. It doesn't say slightly lower. It says much lower. Now it is notable that there are cases where they'll order a retrial and the retrial will actually give them more. That'll be worse for them. That can happen. And if all 5, or even if the majority ruling was to a retrial, that could be the result. Particularly if it was majority ruling, let's say 3 saying retrial and 2 saying, no, make it bigger. If that was the case and they did a retrial, there's every chance he'd be found guilty with a bigger fine. But that's not the case. So, I'm just going to rehash this. Wikipedia are lying. This is not an interpretation issue. They're lying. They haven't adjusted their core parts of it. And they could say, oh, that's a historical document, fair enough. But they haven't adjusted their conclusion, and they've only got 10 words in there, which is an absolute lie. NBC News are lying. This is not an interpretation issue. In fact, they've said a fact check, which is a lie. Because you can read the judgment yourself, and okay, you need to learn a bit of legalese to know what that really means in real terms, but you can look at the judgment yourself. And okay, so NBC News may have the excuse of saying, well, we don't understand what the heck they meant, we just decided. Okay, so get someone that does understand. Now, Megyn Kelly what she said was pretty much true. Now, you could then say, okay, Donald Trump, what he said was not necessarily true. However, he said what one of the 5 judges said, pretty much verbatim. But he's made it claim as if that is the whole judgment. And you might say, well, Donald Trump's lying. Only one of the 5 judges said that. However, one of the 5 said it. He's in the trial. He has every reason to say, put his spin on it, every reason to do that. But not only that, but we haven't actually finished this appeal. Because that's just their judgment. And then they have to just go back and decide what happens with it. Now, I'm going to look at some things that they unanimously decided. So, 4 out of 5 decided that he was guilty of overestimating assets and underestimating assets. 1 out of 5 said he's not guilty of that, but we can take the majority view. Pretty much unanimous, he's guilty. Okay, good, we've got that bit. So I'm going to just look at what everybody just agrees on. Second thing is that all 5 appeals judges said that the amount is excessive. Not just a little bit excessive, but extremely excessive. Of course, one said shouldn't have been fined anything. So anyone saying this is a minor technicality, that's absolute lie. It's not a minor technicality, it's a gross miscarriage of justice in terms of the amount. I'll get onto that. They also unanimously agreed, all 5 appeals justices unanimously agreed, there was no actual victim. So Deutsche Bank was one of the main banks that was doing it. They have not claimed that they were aggrieved. In fact, no bank has claimed to be aggrieved. No person has claimed to be aggrieved by this. So it's a bit like if, and I can use a criminal law thing, if someone was punched, but they said, no, that's all right, then no crime has been committed. However, and I'm hearing you saying this, no, there are times when you can have a fight in the middle of the street, and even though neither side complains, it can still be a crime because it can be public disorderly. Okay, that's true. So if a crime is being committed, it's committed by both Trump and the bank equally. The bank hasn't been charged. Just Trump, that's not fair. Not only that, all 5 of the justices, the appeals judges, have decided that it was heard in the wrong jurisdiction. Now this is very important. So New York State are getting $500 million worth of fine, currently $550 million. They have no right to that because the property we're talking about, Mar-a-Lago, is in Florida, the state of Florida. It's not in New York, it's in Florida. That's the main piece of real estate that was overvalued and undervalued and all that. The bank, Deutsche Bank, is headquartered in Germany. So the 2 jurisdictions you could use are either the state of Florida or the country of Germany. Now, to have to work out which part of Germany, if they even care. Germany's not that big a country. I don't know if they even distinguish between different jurisdictions. But, I mean, I know there's 40 million people or so there, but in terms of land, it's not that big. Not like USA that just goes forever. This is, Germany is physically a fairly small area. I don't know if they have separate laws depending on where you are. USA does, but most countries don't. And even though, like Australia, for example, can have a few slightly different laws depending on which state or territory you're in, but we're pretty much having pretty similar laws. And USA have very different laws in which each state and federally. That's unusual. That doesn't normally happen in most countries. So, the correct jurisdiction would have been either Florida if you're focusing on the real estate, or Germany if you're focusing on the bank. So if the bank was an aggrieved party, which they're not, it should have been heard in Germany. Now, if they wanted to say, okay, but it's the real estate thing and it's damaged because there's innocent parties that are being hurt by it, it should have been heard in Florida. So if we accept that there was no aggrieved party, hear it in Florida. If there was an aggrieved party, which all appeals judges have agreed there wasn't, the only aggrieved party that's possible is the bank, so it should have been heard in Germany. Now, Germany don't want to prosecute. The bank aren't complaining, still not. And the state of Florida don't want to prosecute. So with that in mind, there is no jurisdiction left for this, and it therefore can't be heard. So therefore, if you issued a retrial, which 2 of the 5 judges said to do, there is no jurisdiction open to hear it. So, and whoever decided that it was okay to hear it in New York made a mistake. So all the appeals judges have agreed that it was wrong to hear it in New York. New York had no case to call this in. Now, this is quite important when you're talking about laws that can differ in each state and all that sort of stuff. So, New York had no right to get it because, and this is the thing, the only group that benefits from this is New York State. So they would get $550 million US. And also it's important to note that the prosecution was New York. So the prosecution in New York, the only beneficiary is New York because they get a fine. Now you can see that's a massive conflict of interest. You're the prosecution and you are also the beneficiary, the sole beneficiary, and supposedly the aggrieved party. Although how you're aggrieved hasn't been explained. So that's a degree of corruption there. And it's quite important to note this. So, again, like, there's no reason to suggest that New York were actually an aggrieved party. He does have property in New York, but that's not the property that was overstated or understated. That was Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Florida haven't complained. Now, you can argue, okay, hang on, this is about him getting favourable loans. Fair enough. And he got favourable loans based on telling lies about how much or how little his property was worth. He did. There's no doubt about that. Well, one judge says there's a doubt. I don't think there's any serious doubt that he got favourable loans. So he got better interest rates than he should have got. I don't know what interest rates he got, but let's say he got 8%, should have had to get 12. He had to pay back less money than he should have. That's a crime. Well, it is if the bank doesn't like that. Bank has every right to say that's a crime. They didn't. They have not made a complaint about it. Not made a complaint in New York. They haven't made a complaint in Florida. They haven't made a complaint in Germany. They haven't made any kind of complaint. They're happy with it. And this is the other thing. If I go to a bank and they say, oh, the loan is going to be 12%. But then I say, oh, please, please. I say, look, we like you. I'll give it to you for 8%. That's not illegal. And the Deutsche Bank could well have said, well, we like you, Donald. We've dealt with you a lot. We're going to give it to you for 8% instead of 12%. And they did. And in fact, they've said, no, we'll give it to you for 8% next time. Okay, so where is the law broken again? Because they're giving him a favourable rate that they're not giving to someone else. Oh, that's corruption. Okay. Could be. Then penalise the bank as well. You can't just penalise Trump for getting a good loan. Sure, in fact, arguably, and we've had a banking royal commission here in Australia, arguably it's the bank that's at fault, not the person that gets the loan. But then you said, no, wait. They only gave him that good loan because he lied to them. Okay. But the bank should have checked. Isn't the bank the one that's at fault? If anyone? Maybe that's why they don't complain, because they know that legally they might have done the wrong thing. But this is the problem. Is that the bank hasn't been charged. So the state of Florida hasn't charged them. Germany hasn't charged them. New York haven't charged them. So they've charged the wrong person. You might say, oh, but he lied. Yeah, but they should be checking that. Like if I go and I go to a bank, and let's say I go to a bank and I say, oh, look, I want a loan for my house. I say, how much are your assets? And I say, $100 million. And they don't bother to check. And they say, I'll give you 8% instead of 12%. They can then go and say, oh, you lied to us by saying 100 million. And I'll say, well, why didn't you check? I've got a bank balance. It doesn't say 100 million. You know, they say, oh, it says $100. Oh. And there was a Royal Commission that found that's the bank's fault. Now, I know this is Australian law and that's American law, but common sense suggests that the bank actually does have an obligation to check their facts. And they didn't. And they either didn't because they didn't care, or they didn't because they were happy to give him that loan, or because he's a well-known businessman, or whatever. I think we can argue the bank would have known, or should have known, that what the actual value was, and so forth. So, And this is what I think will happen from this. Firstly, I think that when they do all their checks and balances, they'll find that New York were not an aggrieved party, and it was not. They had no right to bring it, and therefore that the amount that Trump has owing is $0. Secondly, I think they'll find that since New York had no right to bring this case, therefore a conviction in the state of New York is improper, and they'll remove the conviction. The third thing, and I think this is where the interesting bit will be, is whether New York has the right to ban him from, or ban his company and children and all that from practicing in New York. Now this is where it gets interesting, because I think that they do technically have a right to ban whoever they like, in a sense. A bit like our swimming pool can say, don't want to serve you, but as long as it's not discriminatory. And this is where it gets interesting. Because Letitia James, who first brought the prosecution, the Attorney General of New York, she brought it because she didn't like Trump. And this is what the judges all agreed on. She had actually campaigned on a platform of trying to get Trump, promising to get Trump. She went after Trump in a case that New York had no right to file, no aggrieved parties, and if anyone did something wrong, it was the bank, not Trump. And she didn't go after the bank. So even though you can say, well, technically, yeah, this is okay, there's a bit of discrimination involved. And now I know you might say, well, but discrimination is only against people, different ethnicities, different races, all that. Maybe sexual preferences and stuff. It's also about political parties. Now, if you can argue, oh, he actually was attacked because he was the president, former president, future president, leader of the Republican Party, all that sort of stuff, that's discrimination. He wasn't going after because he did anything wrong. He was gone after because of his position. Now that's discrimination. So there's if they did go for the banning or restricting aspect without the evidence, I think you'd find there'd be a discrimination case, and I don't think they'd be allowed to do it. So that would probably end up going to federal court and to an anti-discrimination group. And I think that they would lose, and I wouldn't be allowed to ban him or restrict him. Now they can say, we don't like you, and they can say, we think this was unethical, and that you were found guilty, and the guilt wasn't removed. And I don't think that the guilt will be removed. Even if they find and they remove the guilt, they won't actually say that he wasn't guilty. And that might sound like a strange thing to say, but hang on, what are you saying? He was guilty, but he's not going to be found guilty. Well, he was found guilty, but that part's not going to be removed, but yet he's not going to have a record about it. This is where I think we can make some statements. I think we can make a factual statement that says that he did overstate some assets and understated some assets, and he got favourable loan conditions over it. I think we can say quite clearly those are factual statements. However, what we can also say is that that didn't rise to the level of a crime. And I don't think it did, because there were no victims. And I think that we should find, and I said this at the time this happened, but the justices have, I think, used a bit of a common sense, the appeals judges, and they've said, well, with no aggrieved parties, you shouldn't have been giving that sort of penalty. And this is the thing, when you do give a penalty in a civil matter, and you give a fine on top of whatever the judgment is, the fine will usually be less than the amount that they have to pay back. So let's say that this arose from a civil lawsuit from Deutsche Bank to Donald Trump, which again couldn't have been heard in New York, they're the wrong state. But let's say it was heard in Florida, and let's say that he owed $100 million that he owed them from defrauding them. Okay? So if he'd done that, you could have perhaps had a fine of a fraction of that, let's say 20 million, as the fine that the state gets. Again, that could only have been heard in Germany or Florida. Couldn't have been heard in New York, because the main part of the argument was about Mar-a-Lago, not properties in New York. But without that complaint, you can't issue a fine unless you find that both parties were guilty, and they haven't even charged Deutsche Bank. So if they charge Deutsche Bank and Trump together, found them guilty of defrauding everybody or innocent parties, which again they can't do in New York, that they could do in Florida. If they did that, then yes, there could be a fine, even if there's no money to pay back. It's a bit like the equivalent of people having a fight in the street, and a fight in the street could be dangerous even if it's legal because both sides agree to it. Could be dangerous because some innocent bystander might be hurt or even killed. And so you could argue that even though obviously this is not a fight, this is a bank thing, you could argue that there are innocent people on the side that are being aggrieved. And there were innocent people that did argue that, well, I don't think they actually argued they were aggrieved, but there were people that were affected by this. But again, the amount is ridiculous. So what would be a more sensible amount? And I think, I don't think there should be any amount, but if there was an amount, if it was heard in Florida and all that sort of stuff, again, it would depend on what the amount that he owed was. Let's say he owed 100 million, he could have a fine of 20 million. If he owed 100, if he didn't owe anything, the fine would have to be a fair bit less. And I think, $50,000 would be pretty much as high as you could go without having any actual aggrieved parties, unless you can argue successfully that somebody on the side, an innocent party on the side, was hurt, but none of them are arguing anything either. The state are not entitled to compensation because somebody got a favourable loan based on lying. Now, Trump did lie. He did lie about the assets, although he's arguing that he's kind of allowed to. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people go on their taxes and say, oh, I used my phone for work, when they didn't, or they only did 3 times. And that's not fraud. Now, it might technically be a bit of lying, but you're never going to get in trouble for that. It's not fraud. And in fact, it's allowable within the tax rules. And I mean, most people don't claim as much tax as they should. We're out tax time, or sort of a bit after it. And it's the thing, like, if you go to a tax accountant and they do things, and you're like, is that legal? Compared to if you do it yourself, and you wouldn't claim all these things. So, and I think we've got to say that, look, yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that Trump overstated the value of stuff, nor is there any real doubt that he understated the value of other stuff. There's no doubt about that. But does that rise to the level of criminality? No. And in fact, he wasn't found guilty of any crimes. Does it rise to the level of requiring a $550 million fine be paid to the state of New York when they were not a party of this? They were not an aggrieved party, and nobody complained. And I think the answer is they're not entitled to anything. That's my view. Maybe I've misunderstood the judgment. You never know. Maybe I did. And we will see. We will see, because this is not over. And in fact, Letitia James has claimed that she's going to appeal it to a higher court. I don't know if that'll actually happen. I don't think it can happen while this is still being decided. And, I think she'll have to wait until this is finished. It hasn't finished yet. They've just made that judgment, and then they have to apply it and work out what the final dollar amount will be, which they haven't done yet. I would be surprised if her appeal is allowed to be heard, because you have to have a basis for the appeal. And when you've got a court of appeals, what did they err in? What did they get wrong? And it's not just about them getting wrong, they have to have a process that's wrong. And the only thing that I think she could appeal it on is on the fact that it wasn't a majority verdict. So you've got 2 said one thing, 2 said another thing, and 1 said a third thing. And they're usually required to have a majority verdict. But what's happened is that even though there were 3 different opinions, 2 have agreed with the other 2 and formed a middle ground, and which they're then going to flash out. So the 2 that wanted to have a retrial have decided that as a mediation, they're going to agree in principle with finding him guilty, but of a lesser amount. Even though they don't think he's guilty, they think that another court should decide that. So that's the only ground of appeal that I can think of. is that she says, well, actually they should have done a retrial, or they should have thought again until they could agree. However, the fact that you've got two agreeing with two, at least as a part of a sort of agreement, and I think you find that the retrial would have had more favourable to Trump. On that basis, I don't think she'd have grounds for an appeal. Now, is there any other grounds for appeal? I don't think so. So I don't think that she could get an appeal to a high court. But I'm not aware of her grounds for appeal. You have to have grounds. You can't just appeal randomly. And maybe she has a grounds that I'm not aware of that could be heard. But certainly I think that this is a fair judgment, and I think that it will pass the next stage, and it won't be allowed to be appealed at the next stage. And the reason why I think that this appeal was allowed, and why it found effectively in Trump's favour, is because it was so obviously wrong. The original decision was so obviously wrong that it needed to have an appeal. And the reason why I think it's so obviously wrong was the amount was extraordinary. If they decided even up to 10 million, I don't think an appeal would have succeeded. And the appeal was on the 8th Amendment, which says you can't have an absurd penalty. And this is an absurd penalty. You know, $550 million, that didn't even, that's 5 times the amount of all of the loans. So favourable or not, it's 5 times that. What did he benefit? He didn't benefit 500 million. So why is the fine 500 million? The maximum he benefited was like 100 million. So the maximum the fine could have been is like a fifth of that, 20 million. Not 5 times. You don't go like that. You don't steal a $5 loaf of bread, but have to be paying $50,000 for it. No, you pay $5 back, and you might get another dollar for a fine. It's always proportional to what you've stolen, or what you've damaged, or what you've, whatever you've done. And this was an insane amount, and the lack of complainants. Not to mention that it was in the wrong court, right, in the wrong jurisdiction. It just looked like New York just started a case for political reasons and to gain money for themselves, to steal his money, which they're not entitled to. They can't just say, oh, well, here's a rich person, I want their money, we're going to give the money to me. And just have a state that agrees with you because you're their chief lawyer. Because she's the head lawyer for New York State. That's a massive degree of corruption there. For a number of reasons, and yeah, I know there's some parts of the world where people do that quite routinely, and obviously USA is not the fairest country in the world, even though they like to say they are. But yeah, this is, and it was obvious at the time. I mean, if you ever thought that this was a fair judgment, what's wrong with you? I mean, it was pretty obvious. But I think that we were seeing so many completely unfair decisions against Trump all in a row that it sort of, it made it, I think people became a bit complacent and just went, oh, well, see how evil he is, blah, 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 blah. I mean, look, I know that some people are saying some of the decisions right now are unfair. Maybe they were, but I think that they were, yeah, perhaps retaliation, which you shouldn't be doing. Should be retaliating. But yeah, this was completely ridiculous. It was insanely ridiculous. This is... Well, we haven't finished because they will decide what the final amount is. I would be surprised if it's more than 50 million. I am expecting it to be nothing. But you never know, I might be wrong. I'm also expecting that ultimately when they finish it, the conviction will also be vacated. That he will be found not guilty, even though he's guilty. Which I think will be worded in a certain way. So I think that they will find that he did it, but it doesn't rise to the level of criminality. And I think that was how they'll do it. I think they'll say, yeah, he did do it. It's a bit like you can say with the Stormy Daniels thing, you can say, oh yeah, he gave her money. And nobody's disputing that he gave her money. So he gave her money and he misstated what the money was, although arguably that was someone else's fault. But it's not a crime to do that. It's not a crime. It's quite legal. In fact, it's arguably a crime for her to go to court and complain about it. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about that. It is. I mean, it's good to see a bit of justice finally come, but I am very disappointed in America to have this happen in the first place. I think people in America should be ashamed that this has happened in the first place. Not the appeal. The appeal should be celebrated, but that we had to have an appeal. Should have got a right to start with, and the getting the right to start with would have been, oh sorry, you're the wrong state. There's nobody complaining. Throw it out. Is what we should have had happen. Because courts have to be about not just a technicality, but a reality. And the reality is nobody was hurt. And the reality is this is an insane judgment. Anyway, that's all from me. Let me know what you think in the comments if you feel like it. Bye bye now.